Gray Harbor, Maine, 1892. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a harbor town in the last hour before a storm, when the gulls have already gone quiet, and the water turns the color of a bruise, and everyone who knows the coast starts counting the boats still out. That silence had a name in Gray Harbor. The old women who sat on the porch of the mercantile called it the waiting hour, and they said you could tell everything about a person by what they did during it. Some people prayed, some people paced. Nathaniel Hollis climbed the lighthouse stairs 2 at a time and did the thing he always did, which was make sure the lamp would hold against whatever was coming, because the lamp was the only thing standing between the men on the water and the rocks nobody could see once the dark came down. He was 24 years old that autumn, and he had been the assistant keeper at Widow's Point Light for 2 years. Ever since he had walked into Gray Harbor with a satchel, a letter of reference from a lighthouse station in Nova Scotia, and the plain intention of doing steady work for steady pay. He was good at the work. He understood the lamp mechanism the way some men understood horses, by feel more than by instruction. And he had never once let the light go dark on his watch, not through fog, not through the gales that came down from Nova Scotia in November, not through the long gray stretches of February when the whole coast seemed to forget what color the sky was supposed to be. What he had not expected to find at Widow's Point was Josephine Winslow. She was the daughter of Captain Amos Winslow, the head keeper, a broad, quiet man who had run the light for 11 years and who had lost his wife to a fever the winter before Nathaniel arrived. Josephine had come home from her aunt's house in Portland to keep her father's house, and everyone assumed, to wait out a year of mourning before she went back to the life a captain's educated daughter was supposed to have. She had not gone back. She had stayed, first through one winter, and then through a second. And by the time Nathaniel had been at the light 6 months, he understood that she was not staying out of duty anymore, if she ever had been. She stayed because the sea had gotten into her the way it got into some people, and there was no getting it back out. He met her properly on a gray Tuesday morning in his second week, when Captain Winslow brought him up to the lamp room to show him the new wick trimmers, and Josephine was already there, sleeves rolled to the elbow, cleaning the lens glass with a chamois cloth and a concentration that did not stop for visitors. She had looked up at him with eyes the color of the water on a clear day in October, gray shot through with a green that only showed when the light hit it right, and she had said, "You're the new man," not as a question, and gone back to the glass. "I am," he had said. "Mind the third step," she said. "It's loose and my father won't fix it because he says it reminds him to be careful." That was the whole of it. He had thought about it for the rest of the day, and then for a good while longer than that. 2 years is a long time to spend 40 feet from a woman in a lighthouse with 2 rooms and a walkway between them. And Nathaniel Hollis had spent all of it telling himself sensible things. He told himself that Amos Winslow was a fair employer who had taken a chance on a stranger with a letter and a satchel, and that trust of that kind was not something a man complicated for his own comfort. He told himself that Josephine Winslow was the daughter of a ship's captain and the granddaughter, on her mother's side, of one of the oldest shipping families on the coast, and that the distance between her situation and his own was not the kind of distance that closed because a man wished it would. He told himself all of this on a regular schedule, the way another man might wind a clock, and for the better part of a year it had mostly worked. Then in the spring of his second year, she had brought a book up to the lamp room and left it on the shelf beside his logbook without a word, a worn copy of a sea adventure novel with her name written inside the cover in a girl's careful hand from years before, and he had read it in 3 nights by lamp oil after his watch, and left it back on her windowsill with a note folded into the back pages. Just a line about the ending, nothing more. She had found him the next afternoon mending a lobster trap on the rocks below the light, and sat down on the flat stone beside him without being. Invited and talked about the book for the better part of an hour, about whether the captain in it had made the right choice at the end, about what she would have done differently, and he had understood, sitting there with tar on his hands and the tide coming in behind her, that the sensible things had stopped holding. It went the way those things go, slowly, and then all at once. In May, she started walking down to the boathouse in the evenings when he was securing the skiff, first with some excuse about checking the weather glass her father kept there, and then without any excuse at all, because they had both stopped pretending an excuse was needed. In June, the fence around her mother's old garden plot came down in a storm. Half the picket split, and the gate hanging by one hinge. And nobody got to fixing it because Amos Winslow had 11 other things demanding his attention that month. Nathaniel fixed it on a Sunday afternoon without being asked, and she found him halfway through. And instead of thanking him and going inside, she picked up the far end of a picket and held it steady while he nailed it. And they worked in a silence that had stopped needing to be filled with anything. By August, he understood the feeling was not his alone. He understood it on a morning when she came back from walking the tide line with a basket of mussels and stopped near the fence where he was, resetting a hinge, and looked at him the way she had looked at the lens glass that first day, with the same unhurried, unembarrassed attention, and did not look away when he met her eyes. He set down the hinge pin. "Miss Winslow," he said. "You don't have to say it," she said. "I think I do," he said. "I know what this is, and I know what it isn't, and I'm not going to be the reason anything difficult happens to you." She was quiet a moment, looking out at the water instead of at him. "I know you won't," she said. "That's part of why it's difficult." She picked up her basket and walked toward the house. And he stood at the fence a long time after she'd gone, thinking about a man who does the right thing because it is right and not because it costs him nothing. Then he went back to the hinge. It still needed setting. Charles Pemberton came to Gray Harbor for the first time that September, on a schooner flying the Pemberton Shipping Company flag, and Nathaniel had known about him for most of the 2 years he'd worked the light. The way everyone in a small harbor town knows about the family that owns half the wharves and most of the warehouses. The Pembertons ran freight up and down the coast from Boston to the Maritimes, 4 ships and growing, and Charles was the only son, 27 years old, educated at a business college in Boston, being groomed to take the company over from a father whose health was starting to fail. There had been talk for 2 years, the kind of talk that moves through a fishing town at the speed of the tide, that Charles Pemberton had taken an interest in Amos Winslow's daughter, and that the Winslow family, once shipowners themselves before a bad winter and a worse decade had reduced them to a lighthouse post, would not say no to a match with the wealthiest family on the coast. Nathaniel watched the schooner come into the harbor from the lamp-room window, and he watched Charles Pemberton step off it in a good coat with the easy confidence of a man who had never once in his life wondered whether a door would open for him, and something in his chest went very still and very quiet, the way the harbor went still before a storm. He said nothing about it. He kept the lamp clean and the log current and did the work he was paid to do. And in the evenings when Josephine walked down to the boathouse, he was careful, for the first time in a year, to find reasons to be somewhere else. She found him anyway, on a Thursday evening in late September, in the garden whose fence he had mended in June. He came around the corner of the keeper's house, and she was there among the last of the season's flowers, cutting them slowly, the way a person does a thing they know they are doing for the last time. She looked up before he spoke. She had known he was coming. He could see it in the set of her shoulders, the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting for a hard conversation and has decided to stop dreading it and simply have it. "You've heard," she said. "I've heard," he said. He stood at the gate with his cap in his hands, the light going long and gold across the water behind her, the way it does in Maine in the last week before the real cold arrives. "I think I should go," he said. "Not tonight, but soon. It's the right thing, Josie, for you and for your father, and I mean that." She looked down at the flowers in her hand instead of at him. "I know it's what you think is right," she said. "One day you won't think of me at all," he said. "And that will be all right. That's how it ought to go." She looked up then, and there was nothing sad in her face, only the same clear, unhurried attention she had given the lens glass 2 years before. "That," she said quietly, "is the one thing I cannot do." Neither of them moved. The light went from gold to gray around them while they stood there, close enough to touch and further apart than either of them had the right to close. "Goodbye, Nathaniel," she said at last. "Goodbye, Miss Winslow," he said, and put his cap back on and walked back around the corner of the house, and did not look back because he was afraid of what he would do if he did. She stood in the garden until the last of the light was gone, holding the flowers she had cut, and did not go inside until she was sure her face would tell her father nothing. "Before we go further today, I want to ask something of you. Wherever you are listening from, in a kitchen, on a night shift, driving home in the dark, This story is for the in-between hours, the ones that need a little company. If it's keeping you company right now, leave it a like and tell me in the comments where you're listening from tonight. I would like to know. Now let's go back to the harbor, because Nathaniel Hollis is about to leave everything he knows with $11 in his pocket. And he has no idea yet what the winter is going to cost him, or what it is going to give him back. He left before dawn on a Friday, before the gulls were up, and before Amos Winslow had risen to check the lamps extinguishing. He had given his notice the evening before, plainly, without explanation beyond a need to move on that he did not dress up as anything more than it was. Winslow had shaken his hand and said he was sorry to lose a good man, and had not asked why a good man leaves a good post 2 years into steady work, because Amos Winslow had run a lighthouse long enough to know that some questions are kindnesses left unasked. Nathaniel packed one canvas bag, his tools, a spare shirt, and the $11 he had managed to save past his board, and walked the coast road south out of Gray Harbor with the tide going out behind him, which the old fisherman said was either good luck or no luck at all, depending on who you asked. He found work 4 days later, 40 miles down the coast in a smaller harbor called Belhaven, at a modest boatyard and chandlery owned by a retired sea captain named Silas Mercer. Mercer was 71 years old, a widower with no children living, who had spent 40 years running merchant schooners between Boston and the Maritimes before his knees gave out and put him ashore for good. He had built the chandlery himself in the years since, plank by plank, and he ran it alone because the one man who had helped him had died the winter before, and Mercer had not gotten around to replacing him. He needed a hand who understood rigging and knew his way around a boat, and Nathaniel, standing in the doorway with his canvas bag and his letter from the Nova Scotia light station, was plainly that. "You keep a light?" Mercer asked, reading the letter over the top of his spectacles. 2 years, Nathaniel said, assistant keeper. "Why'd you leave a post like that to shovel chandlery stock for an old man?" "I needed to be somewhere else," Nathaniel said, and offered nothing further, and Mercer, who had spent 40 years reading men across the deck of a ship in every kind of weather, looked at him for a long moment and decided that was answer enough. "Pays fair," Mercer said. "Works honest. That's the whole of what I've got to offer." "That's the whole of what I need," Nathaniel said, and Mercer nodded once and put him to work that same afternoon. What Nathaniel did not know when he arrived at Belhaven was that Silas Mercer was dying. The old captain told him in November, at the kitchen table above the chandlery, with the flat, unhurried accuracy of a man who has had time to make his peace with a fact and simply wants it said. His heart, the doctor in Rockland had told him, was failing in the particular slow way that gives a man warning without giving him much choice. 6 months, perhaps less, if the winter was hard. "I've been watching how you work since you got here," Mercer said. "You work like a man who means to keep a thing, not just tend it for wages." Nathaniel said nothing to that. There was nothing that needed saying. "I've no children," Mercer went on. "No family left that the word means anything to. This yard, the schooner in the slip, the house above it, it's 40 years of my life. And I'll be damned if I let it go to a bank or a nephew in Boston who's never touched a line in his life. I'd like it to go to someone who'll work it right." Nathaniel looked at the old man, and then at the ledger open on the table between them, and thought about the fact that he was 24 years old with $11 and a canvas bag when he had walked into Belhaven, and that a man does not simply accept a gift of that size from another man's dying, not without earning some claim to it beyond having been standing nearby when the offer was made. "I'll earn it," he said, "or I won't take it. Give me the winter. Show me what this yard needs to survive it, and let me show you what I'm made of." Mercer studied him for a long moment, the way he might once have studied a squall line coming up over the horizon, deciding how much weather was really in it. "All right," he said at last. "We'll see." What followed was the hardest 6 months of Nathaniel Hollis's life, and the coast of Maine that winter gave every man on it reason to say the same. The storm that came in the second week of December arrived without the courtesy of a name, though the fishermen who lived through it called it the long blow afterward, with the same flat understatement of men who have survived something that did not spare everyone around them. It came in off the Atlantic as a nor'easter that would not leave. 3 days of gale-force wind and freezing rain that turned to sleet, and then to a hard driving snow, seas running so high that boats moored in what should have been sheltered water were smashed against their own docks. Vessels that had ridden out 40 years of Maine winters went down in 3 days. Who had fished the Gulf of Maine since boyhood watched their boats break apart at the mooring and could do nothing but stand on the shore and watch. Nathaniel had read the sky a full week before the worst of it, the particular color and weight to it that a man who has tended a light learns to distrust. And he had spent that week hauling the yard's stock of gear and hardware up out of the low storage shed and into the loft above the shop, and reinforcing the pilings under Mercer's own schooner, the Constance. 40-foot coastal trader that was the old captain's last vessel, and his one remaining pride, with new lines doubled and chafing gear packed in at every point of wear. It was not enough. On the second night of the storm, with the wind screaming through the rigging of every boat still afloat in Belhaven Harbor, word came down the shore road on foot. A boy running from house to house because the telegraph wire was down, that the packet steamer Aurelia, 3 days out of Boston and running for shelter ahead of the storm, had struck the outer ledge at the harbor mouth and was breaking up in the surf with 11 souls aboard, passengers and crew both, and no way for the harbor's own fishing boats to reach her through seas that were killing men who tried to launch even a rowing dory into the harbor's own basin. Nathaniel was on the beach within the quarter hour, along with every able man in Belhaven who had not already lost his own boat to the storm. And what he saw from the shingle told him the fishing boats were right to stay tied. The outer ledge was 300 yards offshore, and the seas breaking over it were running 12 feet and better, white water exploding against black rock in the dark, and somewhere out past the second line of breakers the Aurelia's hull was already canted hard over, her lights still burning, which meant there were still people aboard her who had not yet given up hope of being seen. The harbor had one boat that stood any chance at all in water like that, and it was the Constance, because Silas Mercer had built her heavy and low, and had spent 40 years learning exactly what a boat needed to survive weather that killed other boats. And because Nathaniel had spent the better part of a week making sure she rode secure at her mooring while every other vessel in the harbor came apart around her. Mercer himself was down at the shingle by then, 71 years old and leaning hard on a stick, shouting over the wind that no man alive could take a boat out through that surf and come back, and he was very likely right. And Nathaniel went anyway, because there were people on a broken ship who would drown in the next hour if somebody did not. He did not remember all of it afterward, not in the order it happened, only pieces of it that stayed with him the rest of his life, the way certain things stay with a man regardless of whether he wants to keep them. He remembered getting the Constance off her mooring with 2 other men from the yard, Tom Casey and a boy named Willard who was 17 and should not have come and would not be talked out of it. He remembered the first wave that came over the bow so hard it staggered the whole boat sideways and put 4 inches of freezing water into the well, before they'd cleared the harbor mouth. He remembered the cold as something with weight and intention, not simply an absence of warmth, but a thing pressing in at every seam of his oilskins, looking for the places he was not covered. He remembered losing the feeling in the fingers of his right hand somewhere in the second hour, working the wheel and the sheets anyway because stopping was not a thing available to him. He remembered bringing the Constance up alongside the Aurelia's stern where her boat davits still stood above the water, close enough that a rope could be thrown, not close enough that a mistake would not kill everyone aboard both vessels, and holding her there against a sea that wanted to smash the 2 hulls together for the better part of 40 minutes, while Casey and Willard hauled people down a rope ladder into a boat that was pitching 30 degrees in either direction. They took off 9 of the 11 souls aboard the Aurelia that night. The other 2, a fireman and a deck steward, had gone into the water before the Constance arrived and were never found. Nathaniel carried that fact with him afterward the way a man carries the weight he could not lift, understanding, because he had spent enough time on the water to understand it clearly, that there had been no version of that night in which every soul aboard that ship came home, and that the difference between 9 saved and 11 saved was not a difference that had been his to close, no matter how much of himself he had spent trying. They brought the Constance back into Belhaven Harbor in the gray light before dawn, her rigging ice solid, 3 of her planks stove in below the waterline where she'd taken a blow from wreckage in the dark, riding low enough that Casey worked the bilge pump the whole final run in. Silas Mercer was still on the shingle when they came in, had not moved from that spot in 6 hours, and he did not say anything when Nathaniel came up the beach with his right hand held stiff against his coat, 3 fingers gone white and waxy with the first stage of frostbite that would cost him some feeling in them for the rest of his life. Mercer looked at the 9 survivors being helped up toward the church hall where the women of Belhaven had built up the stove and put on soup. And he looked at his boat listing at her mooring with her plank stove and her rigging frozen white. And he looked at Nathaniel's hand. And he did not say thank you, because there was no version of thank you that would have been the size of what had happened that night. He went back to the chandlery. He came out again a half hour later with the yard's deed and the schooner's papers both. And a will he had apparently had a lawyer in Rockland draw up back in November, and had simply been waiting on the right moment to produce. And he crossed out his own name where it stood at the top of the deed and wrote Nathaniel Hollis above it in a careful, deliberate old man's hand that shook only slightly with the cold. "You earned it," he said, and held it out. And Nathaniel took it with the hand that still worked, and neither man said anything further, because the storm was still blowing itself out around them, and there was a boat to bail and 9 strangers in a church hall who needed dry clothes. And hot food and grief and gratitude both would have to wait their turn behind the work still in front of them. The months after Nathaniel left were not what Josephine Winslow had expected them to be. She had expected to feel the loss sharply and then less sharply, and to move forward in order into the arrangement that had been settling around her for 2 years without her ever quite agreeing to it in words. The courtship proceeded the way courtships proceeded in families like the Pembertons and the Winslows, through visits and correspondence, and the slow accumulation of assumption rather than through any single decisive conversation. And by October, Charles Pemberton was calling on her twice a week and speaking, in the careful roundabout way of a man who considers the outcome already settled, of a wedding in the spring. He was not unkind to her. That was the hardest part of it, because unkindness would have made the whole matter simple. He was attentive and well-spoken and genuinely, as far as she could tell, fond of her, in the manner of a man who has been told his entire life that he is entitled to the things he wants and has therefore never had much cause to examine whether wanting them was the same as deserving them. He asked her opinion on things and appeared to listen to the answer. He was not wrong enough. In any particular she could name to her father or to herself, to make the wrongness of the whole arrangement undeniable, and so she went on participating in it with the composed efficiency of a woman doing what is required, while some other part of her stood off to one side and watched the roses come down out of her mother's garden one by one and did not feel a single thing about the wedding at all. Then, in December, the long blow came up the coast, and it did not spare Gray Harbor any more than it spared Belhaven 40 miles south. The Widow's Point light stood on rock at the harbor mouth and had weathered 100 winters. But the storm surge on the second night drove seas clean over the rock shelf and into the keeper's house itself, and Amos Winslow, out on the gallery in the worst of it trying to clear ice from the lantern glass so the light would not go dark on a night when every vessel on that stretch of coast needed it burning, was struck by a section of ice-loaded railing that tore free in the wind and went down 40 feet to the rocks below. He was found at first light, alive but badly broken, a shattered hip and a blow to the head that left him unconscious for 2 days and confused for a week after that. And for 4 months following, the keeping of Widow's Point light fell to his daughter, because there was no one else to do it, and because Josephine Winslow was her father's daughter in every way that mattered, which meant she did not wait to be asked before doing what needed doing. She kept that light burning every night of that winter without missing an hour, climbing the tower alone in gales that would have kept a lesser keeper below, trimming wicks and polishing lens glass with hands that cracked and bled from the cold, while also nursing her father back from a head injury that for the first month left him unable to remember what year it was, and managing the correspondence and the household accounts besides. She wrote to the Lighthouse Board in Portland requesting a temporary appointment be recognized in her father's name until his recovery. And when the board's reply was slow in coming, she kept the light anyway and dared them to say she hadn't. And by February, the board had stopped asking questions and started simply crediting the log entries, because the log entries were flawless and the light had never once gone dark. It was in managing her father's correspondence that winter that she came across the letters from the Pemberton shipping companies in Surrers. They arrived addressed to her father in his capacity, unofficial but long-standing, as the senior lighthouse authority on that stretch of coast. A man whose word on matters of local maritime safety carried weight with the underwriters in Boston, who insured the vessels running that route. The first letter, dated the previous September, was a routine inquiry regarding the safety inspection records for the packet steamer Aurelia, which the Pemberton Company had recently purchased secondhand and put into service on the Boston run. The second letter, which arrived in January, after the Aurelia had gone down on the ledge outside Belhaven with the loss of 2 lives, was considerably less routine. It was from the same insurer, and it noted, in the careful, guarded language of men who suspect fraud, but have not yet proven it, that the hull and boiler inspection certificate filed for the Aurelia the previous August, the certificate that had cleared her for winter service on an exposed coastal route, bore the signature of an inspector who had, according to the Board of Trade's own records, been dead for over a year. Josephine read that letter twice, sitting at her father's desk with the lamp burning low and her father asleep in the next room, and understood with a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather outside that the wreck which had cost 2 men their lives, and which had nearly cost Nathaniel Hollis 3 fingers and possibly a great deal more, had not been simply an act of God and bad weather. A ship that should never have been cleared for that route in that condition had been put on it anyway, because putting a second-rate, aging hull into cheap winter service made the company money that a proper survey and a proper refit would have delayed by a season. And someone at the Pemberton Shipping Company had signed a dead man's name to a piece of paper to make that possible. She did not write to Charles directly. She wrote instead to her father's oldest friend on the lighthouse board, a man named Ezra Coburn who had known Amos Winslow for 30 years and who sat, as it happened, on a Board of Trade committee reviewing coastal shipping safety in the wake of the Aurelia disaster. And she enclosed copies of both letters with a short, factual note describing nothing beyond what the correspondence itself already said. She was careful, in doing this, to feel nothing that could be mistaken for satisfaction. She did not do it because it served her own situation, though she understood, distantly, in the part of her mind that had gone very quiet and very clear since the letters arrived, that it would. She did it because 2 men had died on a ship that should never have been at sea, and because a woman who had spent 4 months keeping a light burning to save lives she would never meet did not have it in her, having done that, to sit quietly on a piece of paper that named the reason those 2 men had drowned. The inquiry that followed moved slowly, the way such things do, through the winter and into the spring, but it moved, and by April it had reached far enough that the elder Pemberton, in declining health and unwilling to see the family name dragged through a Board of Trade hearing, had quietly settled matters with the insurers and with the Aurelia's owners at considerable cost, and had removed his son from any authority over the company's vessel inspections, a demotion that was reported around Gray Harbor. In the careful roundabout way such things were always reported, as Charles Pemberton having decided to focus his energies on the company's Boston offices instead of the coastal trade. He called on Josephine once more that spring in May, stayed 2 days, and did not raise the subject of a wedding date, and left again for Boston with the particular strained courtesy of a man who understands something has ended without either party having said so, aloud. He did not call again. Josephine did not write to him. The correspondence simply stopped, the way a tide stops rising and starts, without ceremony, to go the other way. Silas Mercer died in April, in the same upstairs room above the chandlery where he had told Nathaniel, 5 months before, that he was dying. He went quietly, in the bed he had slept in for 30 years, and Nathaniel was with him at the end, because Nathaniel had been with him through the whole of that winter, running the yard by day and sitting with the old man in the evenings listening to 40 years of stories about the coast, about ships he had lost and ships he had saved, about a wife dead 11 years whom he still spoke of in the present tense more often than he seemed to notice. The will was probated in Rockland without incident. The earlier document he had shown Nathaniel on the beach the night of the wreck standing exactly as written. The yard, the house above it, the repaired and refitted Constance, and what savings the old captain had kept in the Rockland bank, all of it went to Nathaniel Hollis, 25 years old, 3 fingers on his right hand that would carry a faint permanent stiffness from the frostbite for the rest of his life. A man who had walked into Belhaven 11 months before with a canvas bag and $11. He spent that spring putting the yard back in order, the shed rebuilt properly, the Constance's stove planks replaced and caulked tight, the ledgers brought current. He spent the summer working it harder still, taking on the coastal freight runs the yard had always done a little of and had never had the capital to do properly. And by August the chandlery was turning a profit it had not turned in years. In the evenings, when the work was done, he sat on the porch above the water and thought about a garden in Gray Harbor, 40 miles north, and a woman who had said a thing he had not been able to put down since, no matter how much of that year he had spent trying. He wrote a letter that August, not to Josephine, because he understood he had no particular claim to write to her, whatever had passed between them the previous September. He wrote instead to a woman named Ruth Palfrey, who kept the general store in Gray Harbor and who was known up and down that stretch of coast to know the business of every family within 20 miles of her counter, a fact she managed with a discretion that made her, paradoxically, the safest person to ask a delicate question of, because she never repeated what she was told and never told anyone what she'd been asked. Ruth Palfrey wrote back within the fortnight, 4 sentences in a small, tidy hand. He read them 4 times over. The 3rd sentence was the one that mattered. The Pemberton engagement, if it had ever properly been an engagement at all, was finished, and had been finished since May, and Josephine Winslow had not, so far as anyone in Gray Harbor had observed, appeared to grieve its ending. He saddled no horse, because there were no horses in that line of work, but he closed the yard for 3 days, left Tom Casey in charge of the chandlery counter, and took passage on the coastal packet north to Gray Harbor on a Thursday morning in September, a year, almost to the week, since he had stood in a garden and told a woman she would forget him. The town looked the same. The mercantile porch still held its complement of old women watching the weather. He walked the shore road out to Widow's Point with his bag over his shoulder, past the boathouse, past the fence he had mended in June of the year before, standing exactly as he had left it, and found Ruth Palfrey's store first, because he wanted to hear the rest of what 4 sentences in a letter had not had room to say. Ruth looked up from her counter and studied him for a long moment. The particular careful study of a woman who has been expecting something and was never quite sure when it would arrive.
Nathaniel Hollis, she said.
Mrs. Palfrey, he said. She looked at what a year had done to him, not so much to his face as to the way he stood in a doorway. And she had been reading that particular difference in men for 30 years behind that counter. You own something now, she said. It was not a question. A boatyard, a chandlery, a schooner, he said, 40 miles south. Earned or given? Both, I expect. Mostly earned. She nodded, satisfied, and reached under the counter for nothing in particular, the way she did when she wanted a moment to decide how much to say. The engagement's been over since May, she said. What I didn't put in the letter is that Charles Pemberton hasn't set foot in this harbor since, and that it was Josephine's own doing that ended it, not his family's and not her father's. Though I expect you'd want to hear that part from her and not from me. And her father? He asked. Amos Winslow, Ruth said. Spent this winter half out of his mind with a head injury while his daughter kept that light burning every single night without help from a living soul, and managed his correspondence besides, and in the course of managing it uncovered the very fraud that put the ship on the rocks that near took your hand off. She is not the young woman who used to walk down to the boathouse of an evening with an excuse about the weather glass. She's harder than that now, and better for it, if you want my opinion, which you didn't ask for. She paused. She walks the gallery rail most evenings after the light's lit, checking the lens glass one last time before she comes down for supper. Has done all summer. Today's Thursday, Nathaniel said. It is, Ruth said, and as he turned for the door she added, Nathaniel. He stopped. Don't make a speech of it, she said. The plain thing will do. He nodded and went out, and walked the last mile of the shore road toward Widow's Point with the light already burning gold above the rocks against the coming dark. She was on the gallery when he came up the last rise of the shore road, exactly where Ruth Palfrey had said she would be, one hand resting on the iron rail 40 feet above the rocks, looking out at a horizon gone the color of a bruise with the evening coming on, the way it had looked the night the long blow first announced itself the autumn before. She had not seen him yet. He stopped at the base of the tower and looked up at her for a long moment before he called her name, because he wanted, for just that one moment, to hold the sight of her the way a man holds a breath before he has to let it go one way or the other. Josie, he said. She turned, and even from 40 feet below he could see the change come over her face, not surprise exactly, more the particular stillness of someone who has imagined a moment so many times that its arrival does not startle her so much as settle something that had been unsettled a long while. "You came back," she said, not as a question. The fact of it stated plainly down across the distance between them, the same way she had once told him to mind the third step. "I did," he said. She came down the tower stairs without hurrying, and when she reached the bottom and stood in front of him in the gray evening light, he saw what Ruth Palfrey's careful words had only half prepared him for. A year had done to her what the winter and the wreck and the discovery of a dead man's forged signature had done. Not aged her exactly, but burned away whatever had been decorative in her and left only what was true underneath it. The way weather does to a coastline that has stood against it long enough. He understood, looking at her, that the same thing had likely happened to him. The frostbite and the 30 years of an old man's stories, and the year of running a yard that was now legally, entirely his own, and that she was reading all of it in his face and his stance the same unhurried way she had read the lens glass on the first morning they had ever spoken. "Jesse," she started to say, and caught herself, laughed once, short and surprised at her own slip, because she had been telling a story about a lighthouse keeper to a friend from Portland only the week before, and the name had gotten tangled somewhere in her head with his own. "Nathaniel," she corrected. "I heard you own a yard now, 40 miles south." "I do," he said. He reached into his coat and drew out the deed Silas Mercer had signed on the beach the night of the wreck. The old captain's crossed-out name and his own written above it in that careful shaking hand, and held it out across the space between them the way, a year before in a different sentence entirely, he had told her she would forget him. "I needed you to know it exists," he said. "Not because it changes what I am, but because the last time I stood in front of you I said I wanted the best for you and meant it. And I needed to come back as a man who'd earned the right to have this conversation at all, instead of one who was only asking you to wait on a feeling." She took the deed and read it without hurrying, and looked up. 40 acres of water frontage," she said, "and a schooner, and 3 fingers that don't close all the way." She had seen his hand, he realized, the same unhurried noticing she gave to everything. 2 fingers shy of a full one, he said, and held the hand up briefly, the stiffness in it plain in the evening light. "I don't care about the yard, Nathaniel," she said quietly. "I know," he said, "but I needed you to know regardless." She held his eyes across the last few feet of distance between them. "You were worth this conversation a year ago," she said. "You simply didn't believe it yet." He was quiet a moment. "Do you still believe what you told me in the garden?" he asked. "That you couldn't forget." She did not smile the way she had that evening a year before, sad and certain both at once. She only looked at him steadily, the same gray-green eyes that had first found him over a chamois cloth and a pane of lens glass, and said, "That is still the one thing I cannot do." He crossed the last of the distance and stood in front of her, and took her hand in both of his, the one that worked and the one that did not, and she felt the difference in the fingers where the frost had gotten into them and did not let go of it. Something in him that had been held very tight for a year let go all at once, the way a line goes slack when the strain finally comes off it. And the gallery light burned steady above them both while the last color went out of the western sky. Amos Winslow received Nathaniel the following afternoon in the small keeper's office at the base of the tower. Mostly recovered from his injuries by then, the limp in his hip likely permanent. The headaches from the blow to his skull come down to an occasional dull complaint rather than the confusion that had held him the first month of that winter. He was not entirely the man he had been before December, but the months had given him something the earlier version of himself had perhaps not fully possessed, a plainer sense of what mattered and what did not, sharpened the way a man's sense of such things gets sharpened when he has come close to losing the chance to notice it at all. Nathaniel sat across from him and told him plainly what he had come to say, who he was and where he had been, and what the winter had cost him and given him in equal measure, what Silas Mercer had left him and why, and what he was asking of Amos Winslow now. He did not dress any of it up. He stated it the way he had always done everything, looking the older man directly in the eye. Winslow listened without interrupting, and when Nathaniel had finished he was quiet a long while, turning a pen over in his fingers. "You left my daughter's company a year ago without explaining yourself to me," he said finally. I had reasons I didn't feel I had the right to give you then, Nathaniel said. I'll give them now if you want them. I believe I already know what they were, Winslow said. He looked down at his own hands, at the pen turning between them. My daughter kept this light burning through the worst storm this coast has seen in a decade, alone. While I lay in that bed upstairs, unable to recall what season it was, she ran this station, and she ran my accounts. And in the middle of the worst winter of her life, she found the thread that unraveled a fraud that had already cost 2 men their lives and very nearly cost you your hand along with them. She did all of that without waiting to be told it was her place to do it. He set the pen down. I had gotten it into my head, somewhere in these last few years, that I knew what was best for her future better than she did. I believe I've been reminded otherwise. He stood and extended his hand, and Nathaniel took it. She's down at the garden, Winslow said. Go and ask her what she thinks. It was never really mine to answer for her. Nathaniel found her in the same garden whose fence he had mended 2 Junes before, the pickets holding steady. The last of the season's flowers coming into bloom along the same beds her mother had once kept. Her father's housekeeper, who had been watching the whole business unfold with the poorly concealed interest of a woman who considered herself the soul of discretion, found a reason to be needed in the kitchen the moment Nathaniel came through the gate. My father, Josephine said when he was close enough to speak to. Told me to come and ask you what you think, Nathaniel said. She looked toward the gate where the housekeeper had gone, and then back at him. I think, she said, that I have been thinking the same thing, one way or another, for the better part of a year, and I am tired of waiting for the world to arrange itself around an answer I already have. He crossed the garden and stood in front of her and took her hand, carefully, the right one that no longer closed all the way. And she laid her own hand over it and did not let go. I'm not the same man who stood here a year ago, he said. No, she agreed. But you are the same person underneath it. That was never in question. Yes, he said. That's exactly right. They were married in the small Gray Harbor church in December, a year and 3 months, almost to the week, since the long blow had first come up the coast and broken so much of what it touched. It was not an elaborate wedding. Neither of them had wanted elaborate. The church stood cold and plain with the harbor visible through its tall windows going white with the season's first real snow. And Josephine wore a simple gray dress rather than anything grander, which suited the occasion better than lace would have. Amos Winslow walked his daughter down the short aisle without the aid of a cane, having insisted on that much for the day regardless of what his hip thought about it, and sat afterward in the front pew with the settled expression of a man who has revised a long-held position and found the revision, on reflection, correct. Nathaniel stood at the front of the church in a coat better than any he had owned a year before, because a man who owns a boatyard and a schooner can afford better cloth, though not so fine that he was unrecognizable as the man who had mended a garden fence for no reason but that it needed mending, and who had returned a borrowed book with a note tucked inside its back pages. They settled at Belhaven on the Mercer property, 40 acres of water frontage that an old sea captain had spent a lifetime building and had left, in the end, to a young man willing to risk his own hand and very nearly his life to prove himself worth the gift. Josephine brought to it her knowledge of tides and weather glasses and lighthouse mechanics, and an accounting competence sharpened by 4 months of managing a station's books through crisis, and the particular capacity of a woman who had spent most of her adult life being prepared for one future, and had found, in the end, that she was better prepared than anyone had guessed for an entirely different one. Amos Winslow came down the coast for Sunday supper starting that first winter, and by spring he was walking the yard with Nathaniel pointing out things about tide and current in that stretch of water that Nathaniel had not yet had cause to learn, and Nathaniel listened the way he had always listened to anything worth knowing. The 2 men did not become easy with one another all at once. They became honest with each other first, which turned out to be the only foundation the rest of it could be built on, and by the following summer, the rest of it was solid. On an evening the following April, the same week that had once been meant, in another version of that year that never came to pass, to hold a different wedding entirely, Josephine stood on the porch above the chandlery and looked out at the 40 acres and the water beyond it going gold in the last light, and thought of a garden in Gray Harbor and a thing she had said in it that she had turned out, in the end, to be exactly right about. She heard Nathaniel's step on the boards behind her and did not turn. He came and stood beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. The right arm, the hand at the end of it stiff and permanently marked by a night neither of them would ever entirely stop thinking about. And she laid her own hand over his, and neither of them said anything, because there was nothing left that needed saying. The evening held them both, quiet and complete, and everything was exactly as it was meant to be. Nathaniel Hollis stood in a garden once and told a woman that one day she would forget him, because he believed, at the time, that this was simply the truth, that distance and time do the work they always do, wearing down what was sharp until it is smooth enough to carry without pain, making room, in the end, for whatever has to come next. Josephine looked at him and told him that was the one thing she could not do. She was right. Through a winter that broke ships and nearly broke her father, through the discovery of a fraud that had cost 2 men their lives, through a year of managing a light alone and a correspondence, she stopped answering to a man who had never been the right one. She was right every single day of it. And Nathaniel, who left because it seemed the honest thing to do and spent a year becoming a man he could come back as, was never, in truth, a different person at all. He was the same one who had taken a boat out through a killing sea because there were people on a broken ship who would drown if he did not go, who had earned a dying man's trust with frostbitten fingers in a winter of honest work, who came back to a lighthouse gallery not to prove anything to the world, but because that was simply, unavoidably, who he had always been. He came back the same person she had never managed to forget, because she had understood, long before he did, that some things are never meant to be forgotten in the first place. They are only meant to be waited for and earned. May every one of you listening find your way safely home tonight, wherever home happens to be. Until the next story finds you, keep the light burning.